Hello, everyone, and welcome to One Control Report Podcast, episode 366. My name is Benjamin Yoder. I'm here today to talk to you about a video game. No, lots of video games, not just one, not singular. We are here for the month of March. Now I can say that we're here in the month of March. Because before I was like doing this weird, like, I don't know what week it is when I put this thing out, or like how to identify what week it is. So we are here for the podcast for the month of March, and we're going to be talking about a couple of games, Edo Zombie Uprising, and Sanctum 2. Both of those I sat down and played through. We're going to be talking about some news stories. There's the new Copilot heart shooter. You know, I'm a big Gun Pixies fan, so I'm kind of excited to look at this, even though it's not really related to that franchise in any real way. And then also just some general new tech talk. Some of it is actually really, I think, helpful in the case of VR chat. There's some new stuff for VR chat. Some of it is not so helpful. You know, we're talking about Square Enix and Sega's NFT stuff. There's new stuff with that. So I think the decision we came on to conclusion on this podcast is most this stuff is pretty predatory for the most part. Not that I like want to say for sure, but that's my general impression of this stuff and how it's currently set up. And then also something that's a little bit more vague in between that I just want to kind of explore a little bit is the AI stuff for Xbox. They recently announced Copilot for Xbox, so we're going to talk about that as well. And one other thing we're going to do is, typically I do these kind of postmortems about like how a video went on the Ko-fi and things like that. I think I'm trying to just wrap a lot of things into this podcast. So I think we're just going to kind of bring that discussion to this podcast, talk about what was good, what was bad, and also give a little overview of how it performed. Not great is the answer to that, but that doesn't mean it wasn't worth making. So anyways, in addition to that, because I'm doing the postmortem, I guess it should be pretty clear. The Nintendo video did come out, so if you don't watch that, go check it out. I would highly encourage you to do that. And then also, along with that, we had a Hot Pod Gaming podcast with Josie of the Josie Woe channel, who is a younger Nintendo fan, and I wanted an idea of exactly what she liked about the Switch and was excited about with the Switch too. So go check that out if you haven't done that already. So anyways, complete 180 from Nintendo though. Edo Zombie Uprising. I think that's what it's called. I feel like it gets called Ed-Zero in like the Japanese thing. So maybe it is Ed-Zero Zombie Uprising. I don't know. The reason why I think it's called Edo is because it's set in like feudal Japan kind of thing. But yeah, this is a game that I think it falls into the roguelike genre. I'm not 100% familiar with this genre. I've only really played Let It Die. So in saying that, you're probably not going to get a ton of like super deep insight to me of like how this game stands out in general. But I think what Edo Zombie Uprising does is that it has like a really big, diverse moveset for the characters in the game. And so it's like really satisfying to play in that way. But, it's one of those games where it's really tough to start. It's going to be hard to get past the initial hump here. But once you start getting an idea of like how the game works, what all the items in the game does, it gives you the ability to create a variety of different builds. And because it's all kind of randomized, you're kind of forced in different builds. So you're trying a lot of different things based off like what the game is willing to provide you kind of thing, right? So it's a little bit of a slow game. I feel like I could be wrong. These are like behind the back action roguelite style games. I feel like most of the time they kind of rely on like zombie enemies and things like that. So these kind of slower shambling enemies, and then they'll kind of like sprinkle in, harder enemies that might have better movement and things like that. So it's this kind of this feudal Japan setting that's going on, and aesthetically it's a little plain. It kind of looks like an Unreal Engine game, but you can turn on like a cell shading filter. So one of the things that is like, I don't know if this is like a good or a bad thing about the game, but it's got this like very PS2-esque look to it. And, in some ways I kind of, appreciate that. But when you just use like the raw, visuals of the game, it does look a little plain overall. But it has I think the cell shading worked because this game has like this very like, I don't know how to call it, like Japanese, classical art style painting look. I don't know what the art's called, where it's like on paper with like these clear free brushes and things like this. And the game itself doesn't really look like that, but it helps bring it closer to that aesthetic. And even like the story cutscenes are all narrated by like a very over the top sounding Japanese guy. And like there's this weird clacking sound, which I think is like the storyboards moving and like these pieces of wood clacking together. So I think they're going for a very specific thing here, even if I don't necessarily fully understand what they're going for. aesthetically. So you basically have like 3 types of characters in here. You have a samurai who is on screen right now. If you're watching the video version of this, he's got these like big, wide, sweeping attacks that can kind of like clear crowds and things like that. You also have like a sumo wrestler. I didn't play him much, but he basically, I feel like, has a really good move set for like penetrating crowds, so you can kind of like push through enemies without taking a lot of damage. And then finally there's also like a ninja character, and the ninja character is probably one of the most diverse characters. It's high movement speed, low defense, and things like that, but at the same time also a lot of high damage to individual enemies and things like that. So it's more about like kind of picking off enemies, and they're a lot better in my opinion about like fighting, bosses or kind of like the tougher enemies in the game and things like that. So like any roguelite though, when you start, the level, you have just kind of this random set of stuff going on. It's not necessarily, I have the footage on screen. Oh yeah, there's the sumo guy. He's like the one time I played the sumo guy. You don't start with any like significant moveset. You basically just have like a very standard like combo kind of thing that you can do. And then as you play, or as you start your run, you can kind of pick up different moves, and those kind of play a role in like how much you're able to crowd control, and it really plays a role in like how you actually approach different situations and things like that. So a lot of this game is about getting a variety of like buffs and charms, and these charms have like more specific effects where it's like, oh, this charm increases your damage based off like how much money you have. Or this charm prevents you from getting intoxicated if you drink alcohol and things like that. So it's just a big, wide, like variety of items and things like that just have a lot of variety, different effects on you. And when you play on normal mode, all these items and their descriptions are pretty much given to you. I think when you play on a harder mode, it does obfuscate some of that, so you can use items without necessarily knowing what they do when you're in these high pressure situations. I think this randomization in roguelites it's all about kind of, I feel like, applying levels of pressure to the player to try to, create different scenarios where they are either willing to take risks or trying their hardest to avoid certain risks and things like that. And that creates a lot of tension and things like that. So, but because of this like whole like item and charm system that they have a lot of diversity in what you can do, because they don't just modify your character, they also can modify the enemies and things like that. So you can pick up charms that are like catches you on fire, and ideally you don't want to apply that to yourself, because then you're on fire, unless you have a charm that like increases the damage while you're on fire. But being on fire also hurts you and things like that, right? So it's this weird interconnected set of systems that almost reminds me a little bit of like Breath of the Wild, where like sometimes something being on fire gives you some benefit, because like you can throw food at the enemy who's on fire that you lit on fire, and then you can cook the food by throwing it at them, basically. So it's just like this really interconnected world with a lot of systems that really encourage you to sit down and think about what's in your inventory, how you can use them, does it benefit you, does it hurt the enemy, and how these things kind of like interact with each other. And because it's all randomized, you never can really make one overpower build that like takes you through the rest of the game. When you go through these runs, every enemy gives you some money, and then as you upgrade your skills and things like that, your skills can also increase the amount of money that enemies give you when you kill them. But these moves, this money can basically be used back in town to kind of like buff your character and, give you, stat buffs that might not necessarily apply, or that might not necessarily make a huge difference, but they do try to give you a little bit of extra benefit. Like there's these, I don't know what you'd call them, like these pears and stuff that you can kind of eat. They're like glowing pears. And so you can upgrade the number of these pears you have, and that kind of can be a stat heal and things like that. You also have like a stamina meter as well, where you have to eat food and maintain. So every run you do feels substantially different from each other. Although as you kind of get an idea of like what you want and how to create certain builds, each run can definitely start to feel like, you're looking for these very specific things, and you just have to kind of make decisions of whether or not, what you want to do based off what you find and things like that. So, but overall, I think the thing that matters most to me in this game is that it feels like it just plays really well. I think the combat's really satisfying. I think also they really do a good job with level diversity, where maybe early on it's not as apparent, but there are like a lot of corridor-based levels early on. But as you get into the other levels, there's like, you know, Japanese villages, and all the buildings are like these kind of like 1 to 2 story buildings. And so you can kind of jump between the rooftops, and that gives you some benefits. Enemies can like hang out on the top of roofs and bomb you and things like that. There's like a boat level where there's a bunch of the boats are like booby trapped and things like that. So you have to kind of like avoid, you know, the lasers going around and things like that, and find the thing that's like the security system essentially, and disable it and things like that. So each level I feel like feels pretty substantial, and I feel like each character's movesets generally feel really good for kind of dealing with crowds and things like that. So it's a game largely about crowd control, I feel like, overall, and just making sure you're keeping enemies, you know, a distance away from you to prevent them from doing damage to you, which I think sounds like all video games, but maybe the important thing is that it is, because you have limited resources, it's important to prevent as much damage to you as possible, unless you really have a build that's built on that, or you have a build that just like keeps you at like a really high health. But I think that like stress pull and pull of roguelites is like part of the appeal of this genre as a whole. And I think Edo largely does that really well, and just generally makes it a very good playing game overall. Maybe the one issue is that sometimes it can get a little buggy. I did have one situation where I got stuck, and the game does have in the menu like a unstuck feature where you just go click it and it kind of teleports you back to the main floor. And I also had a level where this whole thing's like separated into like 10 floors. So it's like, oh, this dungeon's 10 floors. And I had one floor where the actual exit to the dungeon never spawned. And so I was just stuck on a floor where there was just no way to get out. And so I had to restart. So I guess it's a little buggy in some sense, but I think it is a very fun game overall. Very budget game, very D3-esque game for sure. But I think it's really, really enjoyable. So anyways, Edo Zombie Uprising. The first PS5 game I've played, actually. So I don't know if there's anything super special about that game in terms of what I've played, but I think it just is a generally really solid game. So yeah. Speaking of solid video games, actually I have no idea if this game will be solid or not. Compile Heart. Did you know Compile Heart? They are I think they're the Neptunia people and things like that. They make anime games mostly, and so they are making this game called was it Scarlead? I wrote down Scarlet Salvation, but I think this actually says Scarlead Salvation now that I'm looking at it. What does the URL say actually? SLS. Okay, so it is Scarlead Salvation. I thought it was Scarlet Salvation. Caught it just in time. This is like an anime girl shooter kind of thing, but it kind of feels like it's based off, there's like a Sony PS5 game called Returnal, and it has a very similar kind of look and aesthetic to it, where there's a lot of these kind of like, I don't know what you would call it, like energy balls that kind of fly at the player, and so it's like almost like this 3D bullet hell kind of look. And I think it is also like a roguelite thing where you're like kind of building, you know, different builds to on different runs and things like that. Excuse me, I don't know what is immediately appealing about this game. One, I do like anime aesthetic, that's for sure. But I think I also still have this thing where when I see a Japanese company try to do a shooter, I am immediately interested because it's the genre that I don't necessarily associate with a Japanese company. So I always feel like they're going to make interesting decisions. Like when you play Peach Beach Splash, there's going to be like a lock-on feature. So it's more about movement, almost like in a Gundam Versus style way than it is a shooter kind of thing, right? And so I feel like I don't see any of that here on the surface level, but I have that association with like Japanese shooters as a whole. But I think the big thing here, what they're just kind of having as the main selling point at the moment, is that there's like a dash mechanic where you can dash through shots and dash through, I think, certain barriers and things like that. And in general, it's just to kind of evade attacks. But there's also like a handful of different style guns, laser guns and things like that. And I'm sure it's just like, you know, the typical guns. And then also there's like a melee stun move kind of thing. So it is a sexy game too. As you take damage, your body armor starts to rip off. Which, you know, I think if you play like something like Sinner or Peach Beach Slash is about right. And they kind of play that up. I think there's like, when they were showing off the game recently at an event, I think you could get like a postcard that was like her with almost all her armor ripped off. So I have on screen now the limited edition version, and like one of the outfits on the big box is her with like, probably 40% of her outfit all ripped up. So they're definitely leaning into that kind of thing. It's interesting because one of the things that kind of was a point of discussion with Kanagawa Jet Girls at the time, which is kind of the, in some ways, spiritual successor to Peach Peach Splash, but it also is a completely different video game because it's like a racing game. That game did not have any outfit ripping. And people at the time felt like it was because Sony was like putting these kind of like overly intrusive, or at least what they would present as overly intrusive things in place that like prevented certain types of sexualization of characters and things like that. However, recently I was thinking with this game, Scarlead, was that what it's called? Scarlead? Scarlead Salvation. I was thinking about this recently, but I feel like the Sony like sexy time discrimination stuff, if you want to call it that, is no longer really much of a thing. I feel like it is generally gone, and I think part of that feeling might be related to like Stellar Blade. That game, I think very much leaned into like the main character being, generally like a sexy lady. I don't know for sure. I never played it, but that was the general feel. Maybe it's just there's too much conversation around it, so it looks that way, even though it's not really that. And Sony like straight up just like partnered with them. I think they maybe have like acquired enough of a stake in that company to make it like them like a second party publisher now. And we're looking at this game here, and I just generally don't feel like this game, like this looks like Senran Kagura level of just like, yeah, it's a sexy lady in her clothes rip off as you take damage kind of thing, right? And I feel like the narrative back then, at least, is that Sony would not necessarily let this fly. And I wonder if you're seeing some kind of like shift back and things like that. I mean, I think one thing that has been more apparent to me is more of a feeling that mobile games probably are having some level of impact on like people's willingness to interact with games like this that are on this more like sexy level kind of thing. It is something I need to talk to somebody at some point about, probably. Not that it's like a really big deal. It's just, to me, it's pretty obvious that's like one of the selling points here, and it's a compile heart game, so that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, it's just I think things go through phases back and forth, and also part of it's your own perception, right? Like, what do you think is happening in the industry? And I think in my mind, it seems like things are shifting back to be a little bit more like, hey, yeah, it's okay if like ladies are sexy kind of thing. I feel like that's not so much as much of an issue with some people, but I'm sure a lot of it depends on the community you're in and who you're talking to and things like that. So, and I've made some very specific choices to engage with that stuff a little bit more to kind of better understand it. So that also could play a role in like why I feel like this stuff has a little more presence. But anyways, Scarlead Salvation comes out May 29th. So I might try it. I think it is a PS5 physical game, so maybe I'll check it out on PlayStation 5. Speaking of anime girls, VR chat. You guys been in VR chat lately? Did I talk about VR chat last time I played it? I did play it a little bit, but the thing I always kind of run into with VR chat is that like I am not really willing to invest in a headset specifically for VR chat, and so that creates some issues. If you're a desktop user, you aren't able to really interact with the world in the way that other people are. This is really important when you are doing games that require you or going to rooms that require you to pick up things like flashlights or kind of put two objects together. Having both hands with the capability to move them together, that alone for that functionality is important. And I think a lot of times they might try to find ways around that where, they help people who are on desktop interact the world in different ways and things like that. But I saw this article on 4Gamer, and it seems like this is in a beta test, but essentially they are adding a mode where you can use your webcam to track, I believe it's three things. Two things, movement and expression. I don't know 100% for sure. This is a Japanese article about this. I probably should have went and found the actual US article about this. But the reason I was reading this Japanese article, we'll get into here in a second. But essentially, it allows you to just use your webcam to do things like move your arms around in the world, as well as, move your head. I think change your facial expressions. So, and then also make little hand poses. So one of the people in this 4Gamer article is showing off being able to do a peace sign kind of thing. And currently it's not available in like the general build of the game, but it sounds like they are planning on making it available in the general build of VR chat. Right now it's only if you're like in this like VR chat like plus program or beta program or something like that. But it was interesting because I think that VR chat is like, when I looked into the numbers, it is pretty steadily increasing in player usage, but a lot of times with VR headset stuff, it is a pretty substantial thing to get into. So the reason I'm looking at like a Japanese article for this is I actually been I've seen, this is the second article I've seen from somebody who talked about playing VR chat and spending like almost like $10,000 or something like that, or it is like $6,000, $7,000 specifically on like their VR chat avatar and buying hardware and stuff like that to be able to navigate in the world. They talk about really wanting to be a cute girl, and so like getting into voice changers and all that stuff. So this person seems to be like fully investing in VR chat in a way that I think is like interesting, and it's kind of interesting to kind of follow maybe not follow the journey, but see what they're saying about, these things they're overcoming to try to get things done. So even though they obviously have the hardware to do things, in a way that's a lot more accurate and things like that, they were talking about how seems like a very nice accessibility feature. And I think for me, whenever this is added to the public build, I'll probably try it out. The biggest problem, from what I could gather from going through the machine translation, the biggest problem really seemed to be that arm tracking is not really there. So it's hard to move your arms around. But when it comes to being able to position your fingers, that seems to be okay. And I believe they said that it does a decent job of tracking your face. But I think part of what made me think about this being kind of an interesting use case is, this sounds a lot like kind of the technology they use for like VTubers and things like that, right? Because from my understanding with VTubers, if you're sitting at home just VTubing, you're just using a webcam for the most part. Unless you're like doing a full body thing or going to like a studio where they're doing full body stuff, you are primarily just using webcams to recognize your facial expression, your movement, and things like that. And I guess in my head, I never really thought about combining those two things in a way that would make a lot of sense in VR chat specifically. Because I do think a lot of the appeal of VR chat is being able to like more directly express yourself through movements and things like that, and facial expressions and stuff like that. So I think, which part of that with facial expression stuff, part of that is like built-in macros and things like that. But anyways, I thought it was an interesting use of what is probably already like fairly accessible tech and tools, to make that a more engaging experience for somebody who doesn't necessarily have a VR headset kind of thing. Because ultimately, I think VR chat is going to thrive on its user base. If you don't have users there, I think you're ultimately not going to have a lot, going on kind of thing. So. Maybe less exciting news. I think people probably are unhappy about this generally, or maybe I should say people on the internet. Xbox announced like Copilot coming to Xbox. And if you don't know, Copilot is basically Microsoft's AI tool thing. I think if you have any kind of Microsoft account, you get access to Copilot. I don't know if that's the free account or just if you do it for paid stuff. Like I pay for Office stuff for work reasons, right? And so if I go to Copilot, I can go use it for whatever. I don't know if it's true across the board or not. So anyways, so they put out like a podcast recently where they're talking about the idea of using Copilot for gaming. And essentially it's like a 30-minute show to really boil it down to, I think, two things. Really it is about walking the user through tutorials. So I think they're trying to replace in-game tutorials with more user-based knowledge, right? So like a lot of games when you go and play them, I was actually talking for a future podcast, talking to somebody about Final Fantasy 14, and the idea that like Final Fantasy 14, you have to go look at like a YouTube video to figure out some of the stuff in that game. I think what they're trying to do is just trying to directly integrate some of this more community-based knowledge into the game. So when you ask questions like, how does this work in the case of what's on screen right now is Minecraft. How does this work in Minecraft? And, I think the use cases they use are always going to be fairly simple, straightforward use cases. But if you can get more of that more obscure knowledge that the game doesn't really surface to the player, I think that makes a lot of sense for a tool like this if you want to try to keep the user in the experience in the game rather than having to pull up their phone, go look at something. I'm not necessarily saying this is like a good use case scenario. I'm just saying the idea behind what this is makes a lot of sense to me. The other thing they kind of talked about was this idea of talking about how to improve player performance. I think in the podcast they use Overwatch as an example, where the player's playing Overwatch, and then the Copilot looks at the current character setup you have and provides suggestions based off the team setup, which I think, I could be wrong, I think Overwatch might already do that, or other games might already do that, where it will highlight characters, be like, hey, this character is probably a little bit better for this kind of team dynamic kind of thing, right? But I assume the point is that it's using a system that's more community-based, and so the community is providing more of that information rather than, the developers themselves kind of highlighting those things. But ultimately, I feel like what they're showing in that demo is that, like, as you play Overwatch, Copilot will suggest things to you of how to improve and things like that. And it makes me think a lot about, like, when I was playing fighting games with people in the fighting game community, where you have a lot of this, like, direct interaction with the people, and people, like, pointing out the things. If it's somebody who's, like, they're trying to support you in what you're doing, people pointing out the things you were doing wrong, right? And being like, hey, you're doing this a lot. There's this one move you're doing a lot, and I'm punishing you every time, and you seem to not be recognizing it, that kind of thing, right? And so I think they're trying to, like, provide that kind of level of assessment as well to the player. How actually useful that is, I think, is kind of up in the air. Obviously, it depends on, like, what is the data it's pulling, how effective is it at delivering that data, and ultimately, what quality is the information that it delivers to the player. I think one thing I've thought a lot more about recently with a lot of these, like, AI chatbots and stuff is how I feel like a lot of it is more about, like, how you segment data so it can make decisions without being, like, poisoned by something else not related. Like when you heard, like, I don't know if you heard the news stories where it's like the airline accidentally giving out, like, super cheap tickets because the person was able to kind of, like, bully the AI into giving them cheap tickets kind of thing, right? Through whatever knowledge it was using. I think, like, trying to restrict AI down to the sense that it, like, lets you answer those questions without it going beyond what it should be capable of doing kind of thing. And I feel like probably one of the things that you might need to run into with something like this is that if it isn't able to recognize, like, what patch a piece of advice is from, or even sometimes what game the advice is from, right? Maybe the game itself that they're talking about is has overlapping things, and it's, like, pulling in wrong information from a different game kind of thing and providing suggestions based off that. I think ultimately this might also kind of line into this idea of, like, what is the right way to play games? I do not like this idea that there's a right way to play games. And you might want to summarize that in other games as, like, the meta or something like that, right? Where somebody basically does so much research to say this is the best way to play something, and people just kind of accept that for what it is, especially if it's, like, a voice of authority saying that, right? And so I think it, like, discourages experimentation on the player's part. That being said, I'm not saying that it's, like, a bad way to play games, but I think it does. I think it's easier to fall into the meta than it is to question yourself and pave your own path kind of thing. And I think there's always temptations to do what is right rather than what is fun at times. So I worry a little bit with something like this that it might end up establishing, like, the right way to play a game based off the amalgamation of community knowledge kind of thing. I don't know how real of a concern that really is. I think most people are probably just looking at this and saying, why would people want this? I think the selling point to me is pretty clear, of basically pulling resources, community resources from the web directly into the game and presenting it in a very readable fashion, in a very context sensitive fashion based off what the player needs, right? That's what this reads to me as. Again, the execution is a whole other thing with the game. So yeah, I think my big concern is, like, what does this do to the player behavior, and what does this mean for how somebody enjoys a game going into the future? And our last major stories here relate to everyone's second favorite topic related after AI, NFTs. um, Sega, they announced pre-registration for Kai Sangoku Kushi Tyson. If you don't know, this is based off a arcade game. I believe a card-based arcade game where you have like this table and you can put cards down on the screen and move them around, and that moves like the generals on the battlefield and things like that. And as far as I'm aware, it's a very popular game. I think there's a DS version of the game as well. But they got like 1 million pre-registrations and things like that. There's not much news beyond that other than just like, it seems like this thing is going to be launching. One thing I did notice, and I think we may have noticed this before when this game was first announced, is that the page itself, the parts that I can machine translate, obviously I'm not necessarily reading all the parts on this page. The parts I can machine translate do not really mention crypto or NFT whatsoever. It is focused on this being a trading card, army card battle is the genre listed when using machine translation. The developer is Double Jump Tokyo. Double Jump Tokyo, if you don't remember, is a team that is very heavily reliant on, or very, very much kind of the core development team behind a lot of like Sega, Square Enix, and Konami NFT efforts. These kind of larger companies trying to get into NFT games. Double Jump Tokyo has been kind of like the backbone of that whole initiative. But yeah, they just really don't mention the kind of NFT stuff until you get into the light paper. The light paper is being, I guess, a white paper, which, is its own whole thing. But once you get into here, then this is where they start talking about the fact that like these are NFT cards and things like that. And even looking at the page that's like the page for the Google Play page in here, there's really not anything in here about that stuff either. What am I closing? There's really not a lot of stuff in here about that stuff either. So many charismatic military commanders who braved through the era of warring states make their appearance. Now, unfortunately, if you ever were curious about this series, this is, I believe, the first one that's going to be localized into English. So please enjoy whatever comes out of that. I don't really have any interest in this particular game in terms of the NFT version. Or at least not without seeing some more gameplay. But, I think a lot of this kind of stuff exists nowadays. I think I would be interested in like an arcade version of this probably. But, the arcade version of this has been around forever. Although I'm curious if it's still around. But, yeah, a lot of very handsome men and women from like feudal Japan, or I guess Three Kingdoms, that China. I don't remember. I don't know enough about Japan and China history. I think that's a battle. Romance of the Three Kingdoms. That is a Chinese thing. So a bunch of handsome and handsome Chinese people is, I guess, what we're getting here with. And then outside of Sega, Square Enix, if you remember, Million Arthur. We've talked about Million Arthur a lot. I remind you guys every time we do this. But Million Arthur had an NFT game that came out. Or rather, it launched NFTs first, which were just stamps themselves as far as where you could own an image. And then they launched an NFT game. And then they shut down the NFT game. And then they proceeded to shut down the actual NFT platform for Million Arthur. This was the first successful NFT project that Square Enix had. Obviously, just like it lasted however many years it did, and eventually it kind of burned out kind of thing. But one thing that they're talking about, if you remember a long time ago when NFTs were first starting to be kind of mentioned in the game industry, there was this idea that like you could carry forward something from one game to another. So you have this hat. You worked so hard for this little hat that you're putting on your guy. And then Square Enix says, we don't want you to have this game anymore because we're losing money. Foam Stars, we're shutting it down. But if Foam Stars was an NFT game, you could take your hat to Final Fantasy VII or something like that, right? Some weird stuff like that, which really, when you think about it, like doesn't really make a lot of sense from a game development standpoint. But what they wanted to do with this game was provide some transfer of value as they shut it down, or this NFT. So the whole point was that if you had NFTs that weren't made into complete NFTs because you could basically make picture NFTs using it. I'm not going to go into detail about it. You could essentially use you can essentially melt that currency down into another currency called, I think, gear points or whatever. And they're saying at some point in the future, you can use this on other games. Well, I don't know if this is the only game that they're announcing for this or like ever, or if this is the first of a wave, but they have announced that you can get your currency, use your currency in a game called Universal Stallion. Now, Universal Stallion, let me tell you, Million Arthur, very cutesy, very funny characters, all that stuff, bunch of anime girls. Universal Stallion is a derby game, which, hey, look, I'm sure there's an overlap of people who like horse derby game and anime girls. There's Uma Musume for a reason, right? But aesthetically, this game does not really match what's happening with Million Arthur. So to me, it kind of feels like, because it's like a very realistic horse racing game looking thing, to me, it feels more like this was like one of the only ones they could really get to accept this kind of thing. I could be wrong, because like essentially you take the currency you had and use it to roll. They do have a special collaboration event going on where you can roll to basically pull riders from Million Arthur, but from what I can tell, they're just character portraits on a screen, not like fully rendered riders or anything like that you can play, at least as far as I could tell. So I went on Twitter because I was curious about like, okay, so here's this idea where you can transfer this currency out. What are people on Twitter, the cryptocurrency haven of the internet, I feel like, saying about this? And the answer is very little. I think there's mostly confusion from people of like, oh, like, how does this really work? Like, does the rarity matter of what my gear was? Does that change how I can pull things? All that kind of stuff. So it seems like there's more confusion more than anything. But one thing that I did see that was an interesting point somebody made, and I want to be very clear, this person is, I believe, potentially, I don't know for sure, potentially could be a developer at Square Enix who works on NFT games, but they do seem to say that they work on NFT projects either way. I get the impression they may be working on Square Enix NFT games, though. I think what they're saying in machine translating this post is, okay, well, now that the game's over, unlike other live service games, where the game shuts down and you just lose everything, this game is providing you some value after the fact. And so even though you kind of can make fun of it for what it was doing, and this is not necessarily what he was saying about that part of it, but in my mind, I guess, based off like what his point being is that like, even in this situation, you can say you got some value out of it versus other games where you get no value out of what you invested, right? Did you pay $8,000 to play Uma Musume, right? When Uma Musume shuts down, that $8,000 is gone. So you are paying games as a service. You are paying for your enjoyment of those characters, and hopefully $8,000 was enough, right? And the thing you're going to get out of that is just the experience of doing it, right? How much that matters or not, I'm not really super interested in like that conversation right now. But I think what this thing is saying is that, but what if you get a fraction of that back? Would you at least take $1,000 back? That being a very huge overstatement of how much money they're getting back, it sounds like. And I really couldn't think of too much to argue against that statement today, right? I think the bigger question is that like, okay, why do people spend $8,000 on one game? Are they getting their value? Are they satisfied by that? And is a company facilitating that in a reasonable sense, or are they exploiting somebody to pull that out? And I think most people would probably lean towards the latter, right? I think one of the problems we run into with gamified investment that we talk about all the time is this idea that, like edutainment, like exergaming, it's a way to kind of emotionally invest you in investing, right? Through characters, through gameplay, or some level of gameplay, right? It's not necessarily, and as much as I kind of say like, oh, these games have no gameplay, a lot of them are like team builders and stuff like that, like traditional mobile games, right? And But the problem is that all these companies are teaching you to invest in them, I think, rather than how to be a smart investor, right? That the gamified investment does not seem interested in teaching you how to be a smart investor. Gamified investment seems to be about emotionally attaching you to something so you invest more money than you normally would. That's my impression of gamified investment, and I think that's the real problem, in my opinion. Or at least when we look at NFT games, stuff like that. All right, I'm not gonna speak to like the monkey stuff. I think there's like a video that has like a ton of views on that, and I don't really have any interest in that specific thing. But when it comes to gaming around crypto and NFT and stuff like that, but I will say it is at least a solid point here that you are getting at least something out of it. So does that necessarily mean that this is the best outcome where you're, playing? I know in America we think horse racing games are silly. In Japan, obviously, it's a little bit more of a thing there. But I do feel like ultimately, when I think about the audience of people who like Million Arthur and the people who are playing horse derby games, while there is some overlap, I think also the interest level is probably going to be fairly limited between them. And just based off the lack of conversation around it, I don't think this horse racing game necessarily replaces, what that game was doing, right? So anyways, those are my thoughts, my feelings on that stuff. I do feel like we are still on the slow down slope of all this stuff. Sega launching this thing, but seems to be clearly not trying to associate it with any of that stuff, despite it being an NFT thing. Which ultimately, I think when you think about the audiences, you need to make a good game first, right? If NFTs are going to matter, you need to make the game good first. How much NFTs actually solve in that problem is a whole other thing that I think so far we have not seen much evidence of it being successful, right? I think still the Square Enix Symbios Genesis games might still be the best use case we've seen, and even that I think could very well be done without real money. Then that starts getting the question of okay, what is gambling with real money versus not gambling with real money? Why do people buy PS2 pachinko games, right? It's a human thing, a human psychology thing of what are the stakes in gambling and how much do the stakes matter and how much does it need to be connected to something that's real versus fake kind of thing. So anyways, I was just kind of interesting to continue to see this, but I think this, I could be wrong. This might be unless there's another game announced that has some Million Arthur connection. I think this might finally be the end of the Million Arthur NFT saga. But we'll see. Maybe Million Arthur will be like, hey, we're going to let you buy more things in other NFT games, and nobody will say anything there as well. But anyways, so it's Ko-fi time. Thank you so much, Demodori, for supporting me again for the month of February this year. Conspicuous Snoop, thank you again for supporting me. I was able to include you in the Nintendo video and stuff like that, so I appreciate you doing that. I think shifting back to not trying to think too much about what a reward structure is, because no matter anytime I try to do any kind of reward, I don't think it really results in anything ever. So it's this weird stress that doesn't really matter. So I'm debating maybe switching from Ko-fi to YouTube memberships, which is yet another transfer. But at the very least, YouTube memberships more directly integrated with the YouTube channel kind of thing. But at the same time, I haven't had any success with Patreon or Ko-fi beyond the donations you guys gave me, which I will say, you guys have given me donations. I guess I'm not trying to downplay what you've done. You guys have given me donations. I got a whole week of work out of the Nintendo video. Part of the reason why the Nintendo video is done is because of you guys. So sorry about that. I would feel like I'm downplaying the whole situation. But yes, I do feel like it's often one person who's doing the brunt of the donating at a time. And I feel a little guilty sometimes. But anyways, don't think too much about it, I guess I'm saying, if you're donating or not donating. So, human brain doesn't know how to communicate things when it comes to money. Nintendo video. Hey, that video came out. I think it was a good self-reflective video. If you watch the Summerbringer video a handful of almost a year and a half ago at this point, I think maybe a year and 3 months ago, the Summerbringer video, I think it actually was pretty similar to that video. I think both of them follow very similar themes of, hey, here's this company I had put a lot of investment in when I was younger, And then I created this idea in my head about what they should be. And then ultimately, they were not that or moved away from that, however you want to look at it. And that created tension, which then ultimately made me less happy with the company kind of thing, right? I think what's really important in these videos, though, is that even though I say that, I think what's really important is respecting what I liked back then, and then also respecting what I like today, and making sure that I am at no point in this process saying I'm a stupid little baby boy who doesn't know anything in that process, right? I think what I did in that video, hopefully, was emphasize the clear benefit of each part of those parts of my life related to Nintendo. And also not saying that there was no reason why I felt the way I did, right? A lot of it came down to, I think, communication, right? A lot of it came down to the particular types of games I was looking for because of that communication. And I think a lot of that was probably also, and the thing I didn't mention in there is like with the console wars and things like that, there was definitely a feeling that you should be on a team. And so if you're on Team Nintendo, you need to be with Nintendo the whole way kind of thing, right? Just not really how any of this works. But, I can understand why I would feel that way. I think community-wise, a lot of communities build up around these companies, right? And so I think it was really good video in terms of just making sure I at no point, I think, undermined myself even when I was younger. I tend to be negative on myself at times. So I think this video is like a lot of me trying to not be too negative on myself in that regard. I think it's also a really good job in terms of like keeping it brief. I think everything that needed to be in that video was in that video. Anything that didn't need to be in that video was removed from that video. So it was kind of on a need-to-know basis. The one thing that maybe is an issue is I kind of assume the Nintendo celeb CEO culture of that time. I assume you know who Reggie Fils-Aimé is. I assume you know who Satoru Iwata is, right? I don't sit there and go down this whole thing of like who they were and why they mattered, right? And I did have somebody say to me that feels like it kind of shrunk the number of people who would be able to relate to the video, which I get. But I also think, when we think about who am I talking to, right? I'm thinking about like the eternally online people who talk about video games who are like complaining about Nintendo all the time, right? And I think those people know about those people. And so maybe they don't know the details of exactly what was happening back then. I think they know the general narrative of like who Reggie is, who a Satoru Iwata is, things like that. I also think in general, I kept the video a little bit more open in terms of what I was saying. And I guess what I mean by that is like, I think I spent a lot less time directing language at the user or the watcher. I think sometimes I do these things in videos where I'll say, you feel this way, or you might do these things, where I think I ultimately kind of took ownership of the feelings that I was trying to convey in the video. Like, I feel this way kind of thing, right? And I think also the big thing as well is like when you end the video, what are you doing at the end of the video, right? Why am I saying all this? And I think if you're saying all this to blame somebody else, which I'm not necessarily saying there's never a realm where that's something that's worthwhile, but in the case of a video like this, I think what was important is I took responsibility for what comes next after this video, right? What comes next after this video? I need to reevaluate Nintendo, right? I need to continue to evaluate Nintendo and continue to appreciate them in different ways and things like that. And I did not end this on this is the end of my relationship with Nintendo. And I did not end this on Nintendo is no longer the thing I wanted them to be kind of thing, right? I'm not saying there's never a video where that couldn't be the case. I'm just saying in this particular case, it's pretty clear to me that needed to be something that I personally was taking ownership of and making sure that I had a clear next step of what to do next after the video. My friend said that it's like a very cathartic video overall, and I would probably agree with him. It was a video that I think in a lot of ways is very much just about like me, like one of the problems with this video is that I really like jumped the gun on like making the video and recording the audio. I think I mentioned to you guys many times before, this was originally an Animal Crossing video. I made the video like, this doesn't make any sense. I posted up an audio-only version of this video last year on the Ko-fi channel. I realized when listening to it this year, I was like, this doesn't make any sense. I sat down and rewrote the conclusion 3 times, recording every time and trying to edit further every time. And it was just this big, long thing. I think I just really had to work out what was happening with me and Nintendo. And I was in the kind of the moment, like me playing Game Builder Garage, I think did a lot to open my eyes of what was happening with me and Nintendo in a way that I don't think I realized was happening at that time. So in some ways you kind of caught me like in the moment, like at this change in time, not necessarily at where I was going after the change, right? And that's something that I don't necessarily know I really communicated super well in the video. Is I don't know if I conveyed that this narrative I've developed in this video is not necessarily the right answer. It just means that this is where I'm at today with this, right? And so 5 years from now, I could be thinking something different with Nintendo. But I really think I just wanted to get it out there. And I think that I had come to enough of a conclusion that I was happy to share that with people. And I think if I had gone where I was like, well, let me spend, another year or two looking at Nintendo and digging into this further, I think I'd be kind of doing something different than what the video was doing, which was looking internally versus looking externally kind of thing. So one thing that does bother me about this video, and I don't know if other people feel this way or not, and part of this might be just like sloppiness of the script, because I was reworking it nonstop. So maybe I shouldn't say sloppiness, but these were basically first or second drafts towards the end, because I was just like, I'm just trying to get this done. I use the word feelings a lot, like this idea that, we need to trust each other's feelings. Like, what does that mean? Because I think I can define that for myself, right? But I think for some people, feelings are a very emotional thing. They're like tapped into. Where for me, feelings are almost like a paragraph of text in my brain, right? Like, so when I think about feelings, it is an explanation of feelings. Where I think with other people, feelings can just be this like amorphous thing of this is the mix of chemicals my brain's sending to my body right now. Like, I can cry in real life and not know why I'm sad, and my brain doesn't process that I'm sad. My body has cried, right? And I feel like for some people it can be kind of the opposite, where they know they are sad and mentally they're connected to that, but they don't necessarily know the words to convey that to somebody. And so when I use words like trusting feelings, I feel like it might not hit with certain people, depending on how they experience feelings. And then so part of this ends up getting to the weird thing of oh, what does it mean to feel? And so that gets to the weird therapy kind of thing. And I think people don't like that kind of position when you kind of start asking those questions. I don't know if it's almost like a feminine way to ask that question kind of thing. And so when you're in YouTube, a space where, 95% of my audience is male, it might be it feels weird to go and do this more get in touch with your feelings kind of point. And I don't like that language. I guess I'm not saying that I use that language, but I feel like the echo of that language is there. And for everybody I talk to, it didn't seem to be a problem. And I think for me, it's not a problem. But I worry that if you are somebody who feels emotions more than you describe emotions, it might not, using the word feeling might not necessarily be the right word. That being said, I could be overemphasizing this for no reason. So yeah, but I think that's probably the thing that when it comes to the video itself, what I would like to improve more is, I think, diversify the language when talking about feelings, and also put a little bit more of a direct message in what that means, rather than just this kind of vague, amorphous idea of what it means to feel kind of thing. Right. If you looked at the video though, I still have the, what's it called up on screen here. I have the the NFT thing up on screen here. If you look at the performance of the video, it did not do particularly well, which I'm not saying that means I regret the video or anything. It got 320 views, and when you look at there's a chart here that shows you the kind of average view. There was a very brief moment of time where it kind of went over my average, and then it really kind of flattened out. And then obviously how many people actually watch the video is kind of another thing from there. Which is interesting, because initially when it came out, the thumbnail actually did very well, it just wasn't really reaching tons of people. So I'm guessing like people who were invested in my channel saw the thumbnail with the icon and everything and clicked in through it. But once YouTube seemed to try to get it to a larger audience, the thumbnail did not seem to succeed. It might just be an overly busy thumbnail. I also feel like I was maybe a little too soft on the selling point of the video. Maybe I need to be a little bit more direct. I don't know what that means exactly. If that's like a has Nintendo changed kind of thing, or I don't know. Like, that's not a great example, but you know, some other messaging that would be a little bit more direct on what exactly is going on in the video. Maybe. I do think it is a very competitive space. There's a lot of people talking about Nintendo a lot, and a lot of people talking about their feelings on Nintendo and how Nintendo has changed over time. So the idea of like me coming into this very highly competitive space and trying to break through with the video that generally probably looks fairly close to what their videos look like, even though I think the core content of the video is different, I think didn't really work out super well. So I may try to reposition the video. Sometimes this stuff as well, it launches poorly, and then eventually YouTube figures out who needs to see it and elevates it. So, but it's definitely one of the I don't want to say worst performings, but you know, it performed on average with a normal YouTube video kind of thing. So, you know, the last two videos I did a lot better generally, that's for sure. So. And like how much does it matter that it reaches people? I think there's always kind of that question. I mean, at the end of the day, why do you communicate? It's to reach people, right? And I think from a personal growth thing, you know, obviously this video is a very personal story. It was a video that very much helped me work through a lot of personal feelings. So I don't regret it. But I think the people I reached were people that already kind of know a lot about how my brain works and my thought process. So it'd be really nice to get some outside perspective on exactly what a video like this did for them, what was good, what was bad, what resonated with them, what didn't resonate with them. I think that would have been really helpful, but because it doesn't really go anywhere, I don't really get any comments on it, right? Like one of my favorite things about the Nier video is not the content of the video, but the commentary in the comment section. A lot of people sharing their thoughts and things like that. So I think that is something that I'm always looking for with these videos. Even the Soul Ringer video, I think, did a really good job with like the comment section and like having people go and like expressing how they feel and things like that. So I think this video didn't really get a lot of that. So, or at least it's mostly people I already knew, and I've had discussions with about this stuff. So I don't know if I like learned a lot from the comment section per se of that video, but I'm still very happy with the video, and maybe I'll try to like reposition it at some point and make it work a different way. So, and lastly, well, that's it for that. So thank you again, Demodori. Thank you again, Conspicuous Snoop, for donating. I really appreciate it. All right, and let's wrap up with Sanctum 2. For the video version of this podcast, I'm not going to be showing any Sanctum 2 footage. The reason why is because there's so much downtime in that game. Most of the time on screen, you just be sitting there staring at me like stare at the floor. kind of thing. But Sanctum, if you don't remember the series, this is like a 4-player tower defense game. But it's like kind of got a mix of like a first-person shooter going on with it as well. So there's a lot of planning and crowd control and things like that going on. In the original one, while it did a good job like kind of establishing this formula for this franchise, I think what it failed to do is really keep things balanced. So making sure that the players themselves felt like a meaningful part of the damage being dealt, as well as the towers themselves, there being a variety of those that just generally weren't very good, and so you had like 2 or 3 tower types you really were heavily investing in. So a lot of Sanctum 2 I feel like is balancing it to make sure that all the towers you have a use case scenario and they all have their own benefit, but also making sure the players themselves feel meaningful. And part of how they did that is I feel like they really scaled the game down. The areas themselves feel a lot more tighter in this game. And then also there's just not a lot that gets in your way. So like in the previous game, the walls that you would build towers on, there, these giant blocks. And so it would kind of like block your line of sight, and they would create these corridors that you'd kind of get in and couldn't get out of. Now the walls are a lot more of these kind of like waist high walls you can jump over, shoot over, and all that stuff. So you can easily see what's happening all around you. And the enemy still stay within it. They won't jump over it or anything like that unless they're an aerial monster or one that has specifically the gimmick of jumping and things like that. But basically just really makes it a lot easier to move around the world, which is really important because there's different classes in this game. So there's like a sniper role, kind of a crowd control role, and then also in the case that what I played was like the shotgun role, which is basically where you are like right up in front on enemies, and the closer you are to the enemies, the more damage you do. And then along with those, you also get like a series of perks. And so from the start, I think you get 1 perk, and then you can kind of upgrade it to 3 total as you level up as you go through the game. But all these perks, I think, do a really good job of like not only enhancing your stats, but also encouraging a different behavior. So there might be one that's like, oh, you'll do additional damage if you have like if you like have 6 enemies around you. So you want to kind of sit within the crowd while you do damage, or you'll do more damage if you're like standing by towers. So if you're like sniping, you want to stand by, whatever tower area you've built up to do more damage. So it's going to encourage you to like stay back rather than kind of go and try to reposition a bunch, right? So these perks, I think, generally do a good job of just like really influencing you as the player and how you interact with the game. And they are all, I think, very good overall. So it's more about choosing how you want to play the game versus there being like kind of one perk that kind of forces you into a certain way to play the game because it's so like good and over the top. So very little in this game feels like unbalanced. In some ways that can often create a game that feels a lot more sterile, but I think at the same time in this game, because there's different classes and because it encourages you to play the game in different ways, it doesn't feel nearly as much as games where it might not necessarily have as much variety in how the game plays. So I can't remember the enemies from the first game super well, but I will say in this game they do spend a lot more time, they spend a lot more time thinking about like how the enemies interact with the different character roles and things like that. There are these like shield enemies, so some characters have to shoot them from behind, but then a shotgun person can't get up on them or else they'll turn around and like shockwave them and stuff. So what happens is when you are like starting a wave, you get a chance to like preview kind of like who's going to be coming in, and you can build your towers based off that. But part of that's also about like as the player saying, hey, what are the enemies I'm going to be most effective at fighting and things like that, right? And in a 4-player group, you can kind of pick and choose. And I don't know if there's any overlap between classes. You might have to choose a class and then stick with it. I don't remember for sure though. In our group, we had everybody divide up between different classes though, so each of us had our own particular strengths and things like that. And the towers can kind of pick up what you can't deal with, and you kind of pick up things that the towers can't deal with and things like that based off what their defenses are, or like if they're aerial ones, if you don't have any anti-air towers and that kind of stuff. And overall, I think aside from a few maps, the balance between the players and the towers are overall really healthy. I think both the towers feel meaningful to spend time in, and then also it feels meaningful for you to play. If you don't play, chances are things aren't going to go well. If you don't build towers, chances are you as a player isn't going to be able to, take care of everything. So I think they did a really good job. And you can also increase the difficulty level if you want as well. So you can get EXP bonuses, which basically means you unlock more of the capabilities, the more perks faster, because you get them as you level kind of thing. So the main campaign of the game, I think generally overall is pretty solid and has a pretty steady progression of challenge level. So it just kind of gets, harder and harder and harder. They start introducing bosses at some point, which basically can attack your towers and destroy turrets and stuff you have. So it requires some additional planning. How do you keep the boss away from your towers? What can you put in between the towers, or what walls you can put in what pattern to like prevent bosses from going and breaking those towers? If you can distract the boss, how can you distract the boss? Who makes the most sense to distract the boss? How to evade that boss? There's a lot of things to consider, I feel like, going on. And then you might need to go and like rebuild your towers, but in most cases in this game, you can go and rebuild it however you want. That does mean there's a lot of downtime if your party does decide that you want to rebuild stuff, because it means basically taking everything down and starting over a lot of times. But I like that it gives you the capability to be flexible if you want to, and so you're not just locked into whatever setup you started at the beginning, and then you don't necessarily know what is going to be coming, and so you might make a build that doesn't actually make sense. The game does try to keep you on your toes, though. There's definitely times where you just don't really have the resources to make the perfect tower setup, or the layout of the map is set up in a way there's just like something inconvenient about it. Or in some cases, it also can be things like there's a timer, so like when you are going into the build round, you only have 50 seconds to build or something like that. And so they do a good job of like integrating these like little spice moments in there to make sure it doesn't just feel like this one solid thing that you're like going through. But at the same time, I also feel like it generally is not the main story itself is generally like okay at best, like not only from a narrative perspective, but also from like there's not a lot of diversity and how the maps develop and things like that. So one of the things that I really appreciate is that this game does have downloadable content, and in that downloadable content, it's very well produced overall, and there's a significant amount more of diversity in the levels. There's a lot more modifiers going on. There's like acid on the ground, or like the levels and shapes of the levels are more extreme to kind of like encourage different types of builds and things like that. So it's not just more content for the sake of content. It feels like real thought went into how do we make each of these levels feel unique from each other and create new and unique challenges based off that. And the monsters themselves feel a lot more creative in like how they interact with the rest of the game, because they'll be like, oh, here's a monster that buffs other monsters. So when you see that monster show up, you have to make decisions as a team who's going after it, and then also is that person able to be reliably able to kill that thing so it doesn't end up creating this monster wave where this guy's going around and buffing a bunch of things. So I think they do a really good job of sprinkling in things that have really big impacts on how you play the game and how you build your bases and things like that. And weirdly enough, the DLC has like way more story than the base game itself. But overall, I think the thing with Sanctum 2 is it's just a better balanced game overall. I think it really empowers the player to play a big role in what's happening, while also making sure the towers are not an afterthought, right? I think that's something that first game lacked, which is the general balance between the players and the types of towers that were on the map. And so I think really overall, it's a really solid kind of just crowd control shooter, almost like in a Serious Sam sense. But it adds that layer of planning and things like that on top of it that I think are really nice. So starts a little plain, but I highly recommend checking it out and going through the entire DLC. I've been needing to sneeze a bunch for some reason. I don't really know why. But anyways, that's it for this show. Thanks for coming. OneCoreWord.com is the website. I don't know if there's any like new content coming up. There'll be Hot Pot Gaming at the beginning of the month again next month. So look forward to that. I'm talking about adventure games. So look forward to that with Bowl of Lentils. So check that out. No new video anytime soon. I might try to do some like YouTube shorts here. I've been putting off trying to do YouTube shorts for a really long time. So I think it'd be good to try out some stuff. Not that I'm like gonna go and like heavily commit to it. Just I think it'd be good to try some stuff out. So I might try something like that, but we'll see. I need to actually set some time aside to do that. So I also got PCFX fan club stuff going on as well. So anyways, thank you guys so much for coming. OneCoreWord.com is the website. Check it out. Otherwise, I will see you guys next month. Bye.